emphasis had been placed on an algorithm to calculate grades and not enough on an individual's performance. It's been a tough few days for 16-year-old Olivia and her dad David. Her dreams of studying medicine after she got results that bore little resemblance to what she was predicted, for now on hold.
I wasn't really nervous at all because I kind of knew what I was expected to get, and then opened up my results and I was completely devastated. I was not heartbroken, I was I thought my dreams were crushed.
After days of defending the process, a U-turn from Scotland's First Minister, who said she wasn't prepared for young people in more deprived areas to think the system is stacked against them.
So despite our best intentions, I do acknowledge that we did not get this right, and I'm sorry for that. But instead of doing what politicians sometimes do and dig our heels in, we are determined to acknowledge that and to put it right.
The anger was down to this. With no exams this year, the Scottish Qualifications Authority calculated grades based on teacher assessments. But 125,000 of those estimates were downgraded, the exam board calibrating the results, taking into account the school's past performance. Higher pass rates for pupils in deprived areas were reduced by more than 15%. In comparison to just under 7% in more affluent areas. The row over results overshadowing the fact that from tomorrow pupils start returning to Scottish schools.
This room is set up 2 metres apart.
Teachers like those here in Kelso focus both on keeping pupils safe and trying to understand how the results system let so many down.
For us it was quite a significant amount that was dropped either one band or down two.
Really?
Yes. Moderation across the schools is very important, and obviously we want that, SQA to have that, but it is a case of each kid's individual, and basing results on the last year's results, it just doesn't sit right with us.
What do we want?
Some Scottish pupils took to the streets to protest their grades. With A-level results in England, Wales and Northern Ireland due out on Thursday, the Prime Minister will be keen to avoid similar scenes.
This year, there's some anxiety about, what grades pupils are going to get, and everybody understands the system that the teachers are setting the grades. Then there's a standardisation system, and we'll do our best to ensure that the hard work of pupils is properly reflected.
Those heading back to school here have been enjoying their last day of the summer holidays after nearly 5 months away. Plans to fix the Scottish grading system that left so many down will be set out tomorrow. Then returning to the classroom, the next big challenge ahead. Lorna Gordon, BBC News in the Scottish Borders.
Well, as we heard there, Scotland schools open their doors from tomorrow. England aims to follow suit in September. The Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, says there's little evidence of coronavirus being transmitted in schools, and the plans to fully reopen schools in England have been guided by the best science. But how safe will classrooms be for pupils and teachers? Our science editor, David Shookman, has been looking at the evidence.
All the signs are that children generally escape the worst of the virus. Studies across Europe show that under 18s make up a tiny fraction of all the cases. So for them, schools should be safe.
For young children, for primary school children, they're probably about half as likely as adults to get infected, and they're extremely unlikely to get unwell. For secondary school children, they behave more like young adults in terms of their risk of infection, but they're also unlikely to get unwell from COVID.
For staff, the risks may be higher, so a lot will depend on careful social distancing and other measures to reduce the chances of infection. Another concern is what happens beyond the gates in the wider community, whether more activity and contacts will allow the virus to reach further. The big worry is what's called the R number, the pace of infection, whether one person spreads the virus to 2 others, for example, and each of them infects 2 more. At the height of the outbreak, the R number was nearly 3, meaning that anyone infected was passing the virus on to 3 others on average. Right now across the UK it's just below 1. Anything above that and the virus could escalate again. Let's assume we're at the lower end of the range of estimates. Reopening primary schools would not make much difference, but secondary schools would have a bigger effect and possibly take us above that critical threshold of 1. But there are things that can be done about it. Contact tracing reaching anyone who may be infected could reduce the rate by as much as 0.7, provided it's carried out more effectively than it is right now. Closing pubs and restaurants would have a similar effect. So with the virus still circulating, will pubs or something else have to give? Scientists say that if children do return to school, adults will have to be more careful than ever.
The temptation is there that you will start resuming everyday life. You might go shopping more, you might go to work more, you'll increase you might go to the gym that you haven't been able to go to while your kids have been at home. And it's really those contacts we have to be really careful not to increase.
In any event, there are no guarantees. A few schools in various parts of the world have experienced outbreaks. Usually they're blamed on a lack of attention, showing how basic measures really matter. David Schuckman, BBC News.
Well, let's go back to this row about exam results, which affects the future of hundreds of thousands of young people across the UK. Let's talk to Chris Mason, our political correspondent. Chris, what is the Scottish Government likely to do? We know they're going to make an announcement tomorrow, and then presumably the rest of the UK is going to have to follow suit in order to make things equal across the United Kingdom?
Yeah, we'll hear from Scotland's Education Secretary tomorrow, and what he says will be keenly listened to around the UK. The implication from the Scottish Government today is that they want to look more at individual circumstances around a particular pupil, for instance, and that would suggest a greater role for schools. And this matters in the context of this week because we have the A-level results in England, Wales and Northern Ireland coming on Thursday. And whilst there are slightly different systems around the UK, the model is similar. How has it worked? Well, schools had to predict results and then submit them. But crucially, amongst other things, the past performance of individual schools was taken into account. Now, that has happened because they felt if they didn't do that, overall the results this year would be up by around 10%. And so they wouldn't be comparable with other years and they wouldn't be fair. But it does mean that if you are an outstanding pupil, for instance, in a poorly performing school, you might have your results unfairly marked down. Now, in England, I'm told by a source at the Department for Education, provisional data suggests around 1 to 2% higher the overall results as far as A-levels are concerned, and that there is an appeals process. It's going to be a big week across the UK for pupils, whether they're returning to school, looking forward to in a couple of weeks' time doing exactly that, or awaiting results. A big week for pupils, for parents and for governments.
Chris, thanks very much. In the last half hour, the entire Lebanese government has resigned following last Tuesday's catastrophic explosion in Beirut. The Prime Minister said it was the result of endemic corruption. The blast left more than 200 people dead and hundreds of thousands of people homeless. There have been protests surrounding the government's handling of the crisis as the country faces economic collapse and food shortages. Our Middle East correspondent Quentin Somerville is in Beirut for us this evening. And the government's been under intense pressure and has now just stepped down, Quentin.
Yes, they did just step down, and there were celebrations here in Beirut's Martyrs Square. But if you just look over here, you can see that riot police have been deployed. They then fired tear gas to remove the protesters who fell back. Those protesters, though, are very cynical that even getting rid of this government will make any difference to Lebanon and bring accountability for that deadly explosion which happened just a couple of blocks away from where I am in the port. My report contains some distressing images. Inch by inch, Lebanon's government is coming apart. The explosion here has unleashed a new fury on the streets. Even among the tear gas, these protesters can almost smell the government's downfall. But they've brought down governments before and there's been little change here. A reshuffling of the same old faces at the top isn't going to solve Lebanon's crisis. The state is out in force in a shattered capital, carrying guns though, not brooms. The Lebanese are famous for their determination, but people here are sick of being left to fend for themselves.
Nobody else but the youth is going to help here, and like as you see, you can see some people from the government here, and they just sit and do nothing.
It's not fixing. Like, we do revolution, it doesn't help. We become more aggressive, it won't help either. So it's like, so what can we do other than clean at the moment?
Some bonds in Beirut remain unbroken. Naji Massoud lived in this Beirut flat for 70 years, just 2 blocks from the port. He and his wife were here during the explosion.
This is our kitchen.
Most of their doors and windows are gone. Is it time to leave, I ask?
No. I stay with the tent here.
Jumeirah is a tight neighbourhood. A dozen people died on this one corner, and everybody here knows exactly where their neighbours were when the blast hit. But some are in no position to help. Their wounds are too raw. Romy Zarkour Loré was in her car on the highway by the port. She and her husband filmed the fire before the explosion.
When we arrived to the Hotel J hospital, it was like a movie. I had more chance than others because I saw that people on the road, people lost their eyes.
Today she's having plastic surgery. Dr. Joe Baroud is offering his services to the wounded for free.
It's my guts telling me that if you can at least offer some kind of your expertise to help the people, because you know, if I'm gonna go and walk on the street in 5 months and see people with bad scars on their face, I'm gonna feel directly responsible for it.
This disaster brought the Lebanese people together, but it's also tearing the country apart. Quentin Somerville, BBC News, Beirut.
There have been 21 deaths of people who tested positive for coronavirus recorded across the UK over the last 24-hour period. Figures are always lower following the weekend. Meanwhile, the Health Secretary has announced that the National Test and Trace scheme is now going to be cut. Well, our Health Editor Hugh Pym is here. And Hugh, we know that Test and Trace is absolutely critical for us to get out of this pandemic. So what's this about?
Well, Fiona, we've been told that the number of contact tracers used by the NHS Test and Trace system in England will be cut from 18,000 to 12,000. These are the people who chase up the contacts of those who've tested positive to tell them to self-isolate. Now, we've reported before now that there are some contact tracers who just haven't had enough to do. They've been sitting around waiting for calls which never come in to follow up, so perhaps that was inevitable. We're also told that the 12,000 who are still there in the national system will work much more closely with local authorities, sharing data and cooperating on that basis. Now, critics have said before now that the national system seems to be working differently from what's going on locally. Local officials have been frustrated, so it's much better that they are working together like that. So that'll be seen as a bit of a U-turn. Others have said that the test and trace system is still reaching fewer than 80% of those who test positive to get their contacts in the first place. The word, though, from health sources is, well, it was probably better to have too many contact tracers and then cut back than the other way around. It can be stepped up in the winter if need be, and that this was always an evolutionary process. So a national system working better with local can only be a good thing.
Thank you. Gyms, swimming pools, leisure centres and play centres are reopening as lockdown continues to ease in Wales. The Welsh Government says businesses are legally required to minimise the risk of exposure to coronavirus on their premises. Councils have been given extra powers to enforce these requirements and can issue improvement notices or, in the event of a serious breach of regulations, issue an order to close. It's now compulsory to wear a mask in shops and other enclosed public spaces in Northern Ireland. The decision was taken last week as part of efforts to suppress coronavirus. Infections in Northern Ireland have risen threefold since early July. Stormont says it wants enforcement to be light touch, but warns fines of up to £60 are possible. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has been out with the Coast Guard in Dover as pressure grows to reduce the number of migrants crossing the Channel from France. A boat of 20 Syrian migrants was intercepted by a border force this morning, and 4,000 migrants have successfully crossed the Channel in small boats this year alone. Our Home Editor, Mark Easton, reports.
On land, at sea, and in the air. Today, the government sought to reassure its citizens that it can control Britain's borders. The Home Secretary, here in the blue dress, boarded a police patrol boat with a personal photographer to underline her determination to stop the dinghies breaching UK sovereignty. She was unavailable for interview.
Where are you from? Syria!
The political frustration is evident. Today, the Prime Minister suggested he might send government lawyers into the maze of international laws and conventions that structures Britain's responsibilities to migrants.
To look at the legal framework that we have that means that when people do get here, Sam, it is very, very difficult then to send them away again, even though blatantly they've come here illegally.
155 migrants arriving on small boats have been deported from the UK since the beginning of 2019, but that's less than 3% of those who've reached Britain's beaches. There is an EU agreement, the Dublin Regulation, which says asylum seekers are the responsibility of the first country they reach, but that deal expires with full Brexit in less than 6 months.
Anytime you want to send people to another country, you need the consent of that country. You can't just go into French waters or fly planes into France or however you might do it without the consent of France or any other country for that matter.
Talks between French and British representatives are being held in France tomorrow, and there is urgency. Without a deal by December, it's suggested Brexit may make it more difficult for Britain to control the country's borders.
It means that all the migrants that arrived in Europe in the last few years and get fingerprinted in Greece or Italy can now go to the UK without facing the risk of being deported.
Military force may send a message, but controlling international immigration can only be achieved through international agreement. Mark Easton, BBC News.
The time is coming up to 6:20. Our top story this evening. Nicola Sturgeon apologises to Scottish pupils amid a growing row over exam results. And coming up, calls for counselling services that try to change someone's sexuality to be banned. We hear one man's story.
Coming up at 6:30, selling her clothes to make ends meet. The rise in students facing financial difficulties in lockdown. And we meet 7-year-old Braden Bull making a remarkable recovery after life-saving open heart surgery.
The Olympic medalist Nile Wilson has criticised a culture of abuse in British gymnastics, saying athletes are treated like pieces of meat. The 24-year-old who won bronze at Rio 2016 is the highest profile male gymnast to speak out after a series of allegations of mistreatment in the sport in recent weeks. He's been speaking exclusively to our sports editor, Dan Rowan.
In British gymnastics, it doesn't get much bigger than Nile Wilson. The Yorkshireman becoming an Olympic medalist at the Rio Games. In recent weeks, he's seen his sport engulfed by a flood of allegations of mistreatment, and now he's decided to speak out, telling me gymnastics has serious issues to address.
I would absolutely describe it as a culture of abuse. And I've lived and breathed it for 20 years, Dan. It's emotional manipulation and sort of being pushed through physical pain was certainly something I experienced. The gymnasts are still, in my opinion, treated like pieces of meat.
Would you say that you were abused yourself?
I would say that I was abused. But we wanted to win medals. We wanted to win Olympic medals. The governing body wanted to win Olympic medals. The coaches wanted to win Olympic medals.
In a statement, British Gymnastics said any mistreatment of gymnasts is inexcusable at any level. It's vital that concerns are made public. To date, we've not had any complaint from Nile in regard to his gymnastics career. Earlier this year, Wilson made a complaint over an altercation with a senior member of staff at a social event at Leeds Gymnastics Club. It did not relate to his training or coaching staff. Following an internal club investigation, Wilson's grievance was dismissed, a decision upheld after a review by British Gymnastics.
I was told and felt like I was the problem. It was evident that it was brushed under the carpet. I just felt like I wasn't being heard and I was wronged. The governing body and Leeds, they didn't care. They didn't care at all, man.
How'd that make you feel?
Just completely worthless, completely worthless.
Leeds Gymnastics Club said it disputed Wilson's version of events and the allegations referred to were professionally and robustly investigated, the outcomes of which were independently verified. British Gymnastics said the club had dealt with the matter appropriately and stood by the review of the complaint. Wilson left his home club after the case and fears his candour could cost him.
for so long now, we're made to feel fear or scared of speaking out. And if I voice my concern, I may affect my selection for the Olympic Games.